Ever wonder why certain parts of the Bible got cut out over the centuries? Why ancient texts that were around for over 1,000 years just vanished from the versions we know today? The answer goes way beyond theological debates or academic squabbles. There's a biblical tradition that's remained untouched for nearly 2 millennia, preserved deep in the mountains of Ethiopia, and what it reveals about Christ's return is going to completely change how you understand Scripture. The Ethiopian Bible packs 81 books, compared to the 66 in the traditional Protestant version. These extra texts aren't just historical footnotes, they're documents that hold fundamental teachings about the end times, specific prophecies about the Messiah's return, and revelations that were deemed too dangerous to stay accessible to the general public. For centuries, Western scholars mostly shrugged them off or downplayed their importance, but recent investigations are unearthing truths that challenge narratives we've taken as gospel for a long time. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has held its own theological independence since the first centuries of Christianity, standing their ground against the influences of Rome and Constantinople. This autonomy meant they kept texts that other Christian traditions labeled apocryphal or heretical. Among these manuscripts, we find detailed descriptions of specific signs that will precede the second coming of Christ, timelines different from those found in Western canonical versions, and unique interpretations about the nature of the coming messianic kingdom. The Book of Enoch, for instance, is a big deal in the Ethiopian tradition, even getting a shout-out in the New Testament. This text contains detailed prophecies about the last days, descriptions of celestial beings who will descend to earth during Christ's return, and chronologies that significantly differ from traditional eschatological interpretations. Recent linguistic studies are now suggesting that many passages in the New Testament make direct references to the Book of Enoch, indicating that the apostles considered it authoritative scripture. But Enoch isn't the only one grabbing headlines. The Book of Jubilees, also preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, lays out an alternate timeline of human history that culminates in the definitive establishment of God's kingdom on earth. This text describes prophetic cycles of 7,000 years, where the seventh millennium marks the start of the permanent messianic era. According to this timeline, we're fast approaching the end of the 6th millennium, suggesting that Christ's return could be right around the corner. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now so you don't miss revelations like this that can transform your perspective on the Scriptures and the times we're living in. Smash that notification bell too, because we're going to keep digging into biblical mysteries that have been hidden for centuries. The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia wasn't by chance. Historical evidence indicates that the region served as a safe haven for early Christian communities fleeing Roman Empire persecutions and the doctrinal controversies that split the church in the first centuries. These communities brought with them original manuscripts in Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew, which were later translated into Ge'ez, the Ethiopian liturgical language. This direct chain of preservation, without the multiple translations and edits that characterized textual transmission in the West, kept information intact that got lost or messed with in other traditions. The geography played a huge role in this preservation too. The Ethiopian mountains provided natural protection against invasions and external influences that could have led to the destruction or censorship of these manuscripts. During the medieval period, when Europe was going through religious and political upheavals that often resulted in the burning of books deemed heretical, Ethiopian monasteries just kept on copying and preserving their sacred texts without outside interference. Recent archaeological digs in ancient Ethiopian monasteries are unearthing even older manuscripts, some dating back to the first centuries of the Christian era. These documents contain versions of biblical texts that seriously diverge from the standardized versions later adopted by the Western Church. Particularly relevant are the variations found in the prophecies about the end times, which present specific details about events that will precede Christ's return. One of the most jaw-dropping revelations found in these ancient texts refers to the nature of the Messianic kingdom. While many traditional Christian interpretations emphasize spiritual and celestial aspects of this kingdom, the Ethiopian texts preserve detailed descriptions of a literal, physical kingdom that will be established on earth. This kingdom wouldn't be merely a spiritual continuation of the church, but a complete transformation of earthly reality, where Christ would physically rule over all nations for 1,000 years before the final judgment. The Ethiopian manuscripts also preserve specific teachings about the signs leading up to this transformation. Unlike the vague interpretations frequently found in contemporary eschatological studies, these texts provide detailed descriptions of astronomical events, geological shifts, and social changes that will serve as precise indicators of the proximity of Christ's return. Some scholars suggest that many of these signs are already popping up in our current era. What's really wild is the preservation of prophetic timelines that were removed or altered in other biblical traditions. The Jubilee system, for example, gives us a precise temporal framework for understanding when these final events will occur. According to this chronology, based on 49-year cycles, we're currently in the final stretch of a larger prophetic era, rapidly nearing the start of the definitive messianic era. The whole hidden truths thing leads us to even more unsettling discoveries about how crucial info was systematically scrubbed from Western biblical canons. Comparative studies between the Ethiopian Bible and other manuscript traditions reveal that entire books were deliberately excluded from the compilations we know today. The Book of Enoch, preserved completely only in the Ethiopian tradition, contains detailed prophecies about the last days that were deemed too specific or controversial for inclusion in the Western canon. This book lays out events with shocking accuracy that many scholars identify with contemporary developments. Its descriptions of celestial chariots and luminous beings descending from the heavens have uncanny parallels with modern UFO sightings. Even more significant are the warnings about a time when knowledge will multiply and men will travel swiftly from one place to another, characteristics that clearly define our current tech-driven age. The preservation of these texts in isolated monasteries kept this info about Christ's true return intact. While traditional interpretations frequently present this event as a purely spiritual manifestation, the Ethiopian manuscripts describe a literal and physical return, accompanied by dramatic transformations in the very structure of earthly reality. Christ wouldn't just return spiritually to the hearts of the faithful. He would physically establish a global government based on absolute justice. The political implications of these revelations explain why these texts got sidelined. A literal return of Christ establishing an earthly kingdom would fundamentally shake up every existing power structure. No government, empire, or political system could coexist with a direct theocracy led by Christ himself. This perspective is an existential threat to any political or religious establishment that relies on delegated human authority. The Ethiopian texts also preserve specific teachings on what's needed to prepare for this event. Unlike interpretations that emphasize only spiritual aspects like repentance and faith, these manuscripts describe practical, physical preparations that the faithful should make. These include guidelines on sustainable agriculture, community organization, and preserving essential knowledge that will be needed during the transition periods preceding the kingdom's establishment. Recent linguistic investigations have found that many Western translations of eschatological passages lost critical nuances present in the originals. Words describing the nature of Christ's return were systematically spiritualized, stripping away their literal and physical implications. For example, the original term for kingdom in the Aramaic and Hebrew texts carries unequivocally political and governmental connotations, referring to a real administrative structure, not just a spiritual state. This discovery shows how centuries of theological spin gradually turned literal prophecies into spiritual allegories. The process wasn't accidental, but reflected specific political and social pressures. During periods when the Christian Church sought accommodation with imperial powers, interpretations that suggested an alternative divine government became politically inconvenient. Consequently, these interpretations were discouraged or outright suppressed. The Ethiopian Bible also holds specific details about the events right before Christ's return. These include not just celestial signs and natural disasters, but specific social and technological transformations. The texts describe a time when men will speak instantly across great distances, and images will move through the air to all nations simultaneously. Descriptions that precisely match contemporary communication technologies. Even more mind-blowing are the descriptions of a time when the knowledge of creation's secrets will be revealed, and men will manipulate the very essence of life. Scholars identify these passages with recent developments in genetics, biotechnology, and quantum physics. The precision of these descriptions, written over 2,000 years ago, suggests genuine prophetic insight into developments only possible in our era. The Ethiopian manuscripts also contain detailed chronologies that let us pinpoint exactly when these final events will kick off. Based on the biblical system of jubilees and prophetic weeks, these chronologies suggest that we're currently in the final years of the period before the Messianic kingdom's establishment. Some calculations indicate the next decade will be crucial for the fulfillment of these ancient prophecies. What's truly eye-opening is how these texts describe the resistance Christ's return will face. Unlike interpretations that suggest universal acceptance, the Ethiopian manuscripts describe organized, systematic opposition from established power structures. This opposition won't be merely spiritual. It will include coordinated military and political resistance against the establishment of the divine kingdom. This perspective offers a totally different take on the final events in the book of Revelation. What many traditions interpreted as abstract spiritual battles, the Ethiopian texts present as literal conflicts between Christ's established kingdom and world systems that refuse to accept his authority. Armageddon wouldn't be a spiritual metaphor, but a real clash between two fundamentally incompatible forms of government and social organization. The implications of these revelations completely flip our understanding of what it means to be ready for Christ's return. It's not just individual spiritual prep, but community-wide readiness to actively participate in the establishment of a new world order based on divine principles of justice and equity. The faithful won't be passive spectators of these events, but active participants in the transformation of human society. The Ethiopian perspective on preparing for Christ's return reveals practical aspects that got systematically stripped out of Western traditions. While most denominations only push individual spiritual prep through prayer and Bible study, these Ethiopian manuscripts hold detailed instructions on community and social preparation. These instructions include guidelines for establishing self-sustaining communities, developing economic systems based on biblical principles of distributive justice, and creating leadership structures that mirror divine kingdom patterns. The Ethiopian texts describe how faithful communities should organize during the years preceding the definitive establishment of the Messianic kingdom. This organization isn't just spiritual. It covers practical aspects of farming, education, healthcare, and community administration. The manuscripts preserve detailed systems of social organization that would allow Christian communities to function independently of world systems during periods of instability and transition. Especially significant is how these texts tackle technology during the end times. While many contemporary prophetic interpretations see technology as inherently evil, Ethiopian manuscripts offer a more nuanced perspective. Certain technologies are identified as tools Christ himself will use during his earthly kingdom, while others are characterized as instruments of oppression that should be rejected by faithful communities. This distinction creates a totally different framework for understanding how believers should deal with contemporary tech developments. Instead of total rejection or uncritical acceptance, the Ethiopian texts suggest careful discernment based on specific criteria related to technology's impact on human dignity and community autonomy. Technologies that push for centralization of power and dependency are flagged as problematic, while those that strengthen local communities and promote self-sufficiency are seen as potentially beneficial. The manuscripts also contain detailed descriptions of how Christ's return will gradually transform human society. Unlike interpretations that suggest instant supernatural transformation, the Ethiopian texts describe a gradual process of implementing divine kingdom principles. This process will start in specific regions of the world and progressively spread until it encompasses the entire earth. The geography of this transformation is particularly fascinating, as the texts identify specific regions where the Messianic kingdom will first be established. These regions don't necessarily align with contemporary political or religious power centers, but with areas that have maintained greater fidelity to original biblical principles and less corruption from worldly influences. This perspective suggests that the establishment of the divine kingdom will prioritize spiritual authenticity over political or economic influence. The Ethiopian traditions also preserve specific instructions on how to recognize and respond to the events signaling the start of this transformation. These signs include not just natural and celestial phenomena, but specific shifts in global social and political structures. The texts describe periods of growing instability in global financial systems, collapse of traditional political institutions, and the rise of popular movements demanding greater justice and equity. What's especially revealing is how the Ethiopian manuscripts tackle organized resistance against the Messianic kingdom's establishment. This resistance won't just come from secular systems, but will include significant opposition from established religious institutions that refuse to accept the necessary transformations. The texts describe how many organizations calling themselves Christian will actively oppose the true Christ when he returns, because his presence will challenge the power and authority structures these organizations have built over centuries. This perspective offers a profound explanation for many of the conflicts and divisions plaguing contemporary Christianity. The tensions between different denominations and traditions aren't just abstract theological differences, but reflections of a fundamental conflict between those genuinely seeking the divine kingdom's establishment and those primarily looking to maintain their positions of influence and authority within existing systems. The Ethiopian texts also preserve specific descriptions of how Christ's return will impact international relations and global political structure. The establishment of the Messianic kingdom won't immediately wipe out all existing nations and governments, but will create a new framework of relationships based on principles of justice and mutuality. Nations that align with these principles will be progressively incorporated into the divine kingdom, while those that cling to systems of oppression and exploitation will face increasing isolation and eventual forced transformation. This geopolitical vision of the end times dramatically contrasts with interpretations that emphasize only spiritual dimensions or that predict total destruction of world systems. The Ethiopian manuscripts suggest transformed continuity instead of total rupture, where the best characteristics of human societies are preserved and purified, while corrupt elements are gradually eliminated. Have you dropped a comment below yet on which aspect of this Ethiopian tradition hits home the most for you? Is it the preserved practical instructions for community preparation, the specific descriptions of institutional resistance, or maybe the unique perspectives on gradual geopolitical transformation? Your take helps our channel understand which aspects of these ancient traditions resonate deepest with contemporary truth seekers. The whole issue of authority and leadership during the transition to the Messianic kingdom represents another crucial aspect preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts. These texts describe systems of authority that fundamentally differ from both modern democracies and traditional monarchies. Leadership in the divine kingdom will be based on a demonstrated ability to serve and protect the community, rather than political popularity or heredity. Leaders will be chosen through processes that blend spiritual discernment with practical evaluation of competence and character. This leadership structure, rooted in spiritual merit and practical competence, will create significant challenges for contemporary political systems that rely heavily on personal charisma, financial resources, or family connections to determine who reaches positions of power. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserve detailed descriptions of how this transition of authority will happen, suggesting it will be a gradual process rather than an overnight revolution. The sudden and violent transformation. People currently in leadership roles will have opportunities to demonstrate their fitness to continue serving under the new paradigms. But those who refuse to abandon corrupt or exploitative governance methods will naturally be replaced by individuals more aligned with the principles of the divine kingdom. The economic implications of establishing the Messianic kingdom, as preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, offer revolutionary perspectives on how future societies will organize the production, distribution, and consumption of resources. The texts describe economic systems that eliminate both extreme poverty and excessive concentration of wealth, creating structures where the basic needs of all community members are guaranteed while incentives for creativity and productivity are maintained. This delicate balance will be achieved through principles that transcend both pure capitalism and state socialism, incorporating elements of both systems while avoiding their characteristic shortcomings. The question of private versus communal property receives nuanced treatment in the Ethiopian manuscripts. Instead of completely abolishing individual ownership, the Messianic kingdom will establish limits on how much wealth or property any person can accumulate, while ensuring that everyone has sufficient access to resources to live with dignity and pursue their divine purposes. This approach recognizes that some individuals have capacities and responsibilities that require access to greater resources, but it prevents the systematic exploitation that characterizes many contemporary economic systems. The texts also preserve specific descriptions of how technology will be integrated into the divine kingdom in ways that serve humanity instead of dominating it. The Ethiopian tradition suggests that technological advancements will continue during the Messianic kingdom, but they will be primarily directed toward eliminating unnecessary suffering, facilitating communication and education, and allowing people to dedicate more time to spiritual and creative pursuits. Technologies used primarily for surveillance, manipulation, or power concentration will be abandoned or radically transformed to serve more benevolent purposes. This vision of technological integration offers hope for those concerned about the current directions of technological development, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and digital communication systems. The Ethiopian manuscript suggests that these powerful tools are not inherently problematic, but their current use reflects the distorted priorities of social systems that prioritize profit and control over human well-being and spiritual growth. The transformation of education during the Messianic Kingdom represents another fascinating aspect preserved in the Ethiopian tradition. The texts describe educational systems that integrate practical knowledge with spiritual development, eliminating the artificial separation between secular learning and religious instruction that characterizes many contemporary societies. Children will learn technical and academic skills within contexts that also develop their connection to the divine and their understanding of their unique purposes in creation. This holistic approach to education will produce generations of individuals who are simultaneously competent in practical areas and deeply connected with the spiritual dimensions of existence. The manuscript suggests that this integration will eliminate many of the psychological and existential tensions that afflict people in societies where formal education often promotes materialistic views of life that conflict with fundamental human spiritual needs. The question of cultural and linguistic diversity during the Messianic Kingdom receives careful treatment in the Ethiopian texts. Contrary to interpretations that suggest total cultural homogenization, these manuscripts preserve visions of a kingdom where different cultural traditions and expressions are celebrated and preserved, as long as they do not promote oppression or injustice. Languages, arts, cuisines, and regional customs will continue to flourish, but they will be purified of elements that promote division, hatred, or exploitation. This perspective offers hope for communities that fear global spiritual transformations will result in the loss of their distinct cultural identities. The Ethiopian manuscript suggests that the divine values the diversity of human creation and wishes to preserve the unique contributions that different cultures make to the total richness of human experience. What will be eliminated are not cultural differences themselves, but the use of these differences to justify conflict, supremacy, or exclusion. Descriptions of art and creativity during the Messianic Kingdom reveal extraordinary perspectives on how human expression will flourish once liberated from commercial pressures and political propaganda that often distort contemporary art. The texts suggest that artists will have unprecedented freedom to explore profound themes and create works that elevate the human spirit and reveal truths about the nature of reality. This art will be simultaneously more beautiful and more meaningful than much of what is produced under current systems that often reduce art to a commodity or a tool of manipulation. Music, literature, visual arts, and other forms of creative expression will serve as bridges between the physical and spiritual dimensions of existence, helping people understand and experience truths that transcend purely intellectual description. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserve suggestions that this transformed art will play a crucial role in helping humanity continue to evolve spiritually even after the Messianic Kingdom is established. Medicine and healing during the Divine Kingdom represent another area where the Ethiopian texts offer unique perspectives. The manuscripts describe health systems that integrate modern scientific knowledge with spiritual healing practices, eliminating the artificial division between physical medicine and the treatment of the spiritual dimensions of illness. Doctors and healers will work together to treat not only physical symptoms, but also the underlying spiritual causes of ailment. This holistic approach to health will result in the gradual elimination of many diseases that persist because contemporary societies ignore connections between spiritual well-being and physical health. The text suggests that when people live in alignment with their divine purposes and in communities based on love and justice, many forms of physical and mental illness simply cease to manifest. Those conditions that remain will be treated with greater efficacy through methods that address the whole person, instead of focusing only on physical aspects of the disease. The transformations in education during the Messianic Kingdom reveal revolutionary aspects that completely challenge contemporary educational systems. The Ethiopian texts preserve descriptions of learning methods that simultaneously cultivate intellect, practical wisdom, and spiritual development, eliminating the artificial fragmentation that characterizes modern education. Children will grow up learning through direct experiences with masters who not only command technical knowledge, but also embody principles of wisdom and compassion in their teachings. This holistic educational system will produce generations capable of critical thinking, complex problem solving, and maintaining deep connections with divine purpose in their lives. The manuscript suggests that education will include components that modern societies completely neglect, such as the development of spiritual intuition, an understanding of natural laws governing both the physical and spiritual dimensions of reality, and the cultivation of skills to maintain harmony in personal and communal relationships. Family structures during the Messianic Kingdom present transformations that strengthen intergenerational bonds while eliminating dysfunctional patterns that perpetuate trauma through family lineages. The Ethiopian texts describe families where each member is valued for their unique contributions and where conflicts are resolved through principles of love and justice instead of power and manipulation. Parents will receive divine guidance to raise children in ways that nurture their natural gifts without imposing limiting expectations based on restrictive cultural traditions or unfulfilled parental ambitions. Children will grow up in environments where they are simultaneously protected from harmful influences and prepared to assume increasing responsibilities as they mature. The manuscript suggests that these transformed families will serve as stable foundations for larger communities, creating support networks that extend far beyond traditional nuclear families to include deep spiritual connections with other families who share similar commitments to divine principles. Social justice and the legal systems of the Messianic Kingdom represent perhaps the most radical changes described in the Ethiopian texts. The manuscripts preserve visions of societies where laws are based on principles of love, mercy, and restoration instead of punishment and retribution. Crimes will be treated as symptoms of spiritual imbalances that require healing and reintegration instead of isolation and punishment. Judges will be individuals who combine deep knowledge of legal principles with spiritual wisdom to discern not only the superficial facts of cases, but also the deeper motivations and circumstances that led to transgressions. This restorative justice system will focus on healing harm caused by detrimental actions while helping offenders understand and transform patterns of thought and behavior that contributed to their destructive choices. The texts suggest that this approach will result in dramatic reductions in criminality because it will address fundamental causes instead of merely managing superficial symptoms of deeper social problems. Work and productivity during the Messianic Kingdom will undergo transformations that eliminate labor exploitation while maximizing personal fulfillment through meaningful contributions to the common good. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe economic systems where people will work in occupations that align with their natural gifts and genuine passions, eliminating the need for jobs that exist merely to sustain dysfunctional economic structures. The workday will be reduced because technology will be used to eliminate repetitive and degrading tasks, instead of maximizing profits for small elites. Workers will have adequate time for personal development, family relationships, and creative activities that enrich their lives beyond work obligations. The texts suggest that this integration of work with personal purpose will result in levels of productivity and innovation that exceed anything achieved under systems that treat workers as disposable resources. When people work out of love for what they do and a commitment to contributing to the common good, their creativity and energy are unleashed in ways that benefit all of society. Recent archaeological discoveries in various regions of Ethiopia have revealed physical evidence that corroborates many descriptions preserved in the ancient manuscripts concerning preparations for global transformations. Excavations have uncovered architectural structures that embody design principles mentioned in the texts as appropriate for communities that will function during the Messianic Kingdom. These ancient constructions demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of how to create spaces that facilitate both the practical needs and spiritual development of their inhabitants. The archaeological sites include complex irrigation and agricultural systems that suggest ancient civilizations in Ethiopia possessed advanced knowledge of environmental sustainability that could be applied during future transformations. Experts studying these findings note that technologies preserved at these ancient sites often exceed the capabilities of many contemporary societies in terms of efficiency, durability, and minimal environmental impact. This archaeological evidence offers a tangible basis for believing that the descriptions in the Ethiopian manuscripts about transformed societies are not utopian fantasies, but plans based on practical knowledge tested throughout history. Climatic and environmental patterns during the Messianic kingdom represent another aspect where the Ethiopian texts offer unique perspectives on how planet Earth will be restored to conditions that sustain all life abundantly. The manuscripts describe the reversal of environmental damage through methods that combine divine intervention with responsible human participation in planetary healing processes. Deserts will bloom, oceans will be cleansed of pollution, and the atmosphere will be purified of contaminants that currently threaten the health of all living beings. This environmental restoration will not be externally imposed, but will emerge naturally as human societies adopt practices that work in harmony with natural systems instead of exploiting them for short-term gain. The text suggests that when humanity aligns its activities with divine principles of responsible stewardship, the planet responds by regenerating its capacity to sustain abundant life for all species. Climate changes will be stabilized through methods that restore natural balances instead of attempting to control natural systems through technologies that often create additional unintended problems. You've just unearthed truths that have been deliberately hidden for centuries regarding one of the most significant events in human history. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserve revelations about the return of Christ that differ dramatically from the interpretations that have dominated Western Christian thought for over a millennium. These differences aren't minor theological quibbles. They represent completely distinct visions about how, when, and why this return will happen. While mainstream Christian traditions often present the return as a catastrophic event that will destroy the current world to establish a completely new order, the Ethiopian texts describe a gradual process of transformation that works within existing systems to elevate them to higher levels of functioning. This perspective holds profound implications for how Christians today ought to prepare and live their lives while awaiting the fulfillment of these promises. The distinctions begin with fundamental questions about the nature of time and history. Western texts have traditionally interpreted prophecies of the return using linear models, where history moves toward a definitive endpoint, marked by a dramatic intervention that concludes the current era. The Ethiopian manuscripts, on the other hand, operate with cyclical concepts of time where transformations occur through successive waves of change that gradually elevate human consciousness and capabilities. From this perspective, what Westerners call the Second Coming actually represents the culmination of a long process of spiritual preparation that has already begun and continues to unfold through successive generations of dedicated seekers. This Ethiopian approach places a much greater emphasis on human responsibility to facilitate the conditions that will make the return possible and effective, instead of passively waiting for an external intervention that will automatically solve all problems. The texts teach that followers must actively participate in creating communities and societies that reflect the principles of the coming kingdom. This means that the work of preparing for the return is not primarily a matter of individual personal purification, but involves the collective transformation of social, economic, and political structures that currently impede the full flourishing of human potential. The manuscripts describe this preparatory work as an essential part of the return itself, not merely as a necessary antecedent that must be completed before the main event can occur. The practical implications of this perspective are revolutionary for contemporary Christians who have been taught to focus primarily on personal salvation and the afterlife. The Ethiopian texts suggest that true Christian faithfulness requires active engagement with the social and environmental problems of the current world, as an expression of divine love that seeks to restore all creation to a state of harmony and abundance. This doesn't represent an abandonment of spiritual concerns in favor of social activism, but a recognition that the artificial separation between the spiritual and the material is one of the distortions that must be overcome for the kingdom of God to fully manifest on earth. Therefore, Christians who take these Ethiopian teachings seriously find themselves called to lifestyles that integrate prayer and contemplation with work for social justice, environmental care, and the building of economic communities based on cooperation instead of exploitative competition. If you're starting to grasp how these revelations could completely transform your understanding of Christianity and your role as a follower of Christ, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we'll continue exploring these transformative discoveries in future videos. There's so much more to uncover about how these ancient manuscripts can illuminate paths to a more authentic and effective Christian life in the contemporary world. The chronology of the return presented in the Ethiopian texts also challenges mainstream presumptions about when and how these events will unfold. Traditional Western interpretations often focus on attempts to calculate specific dates or identify signs that will indicate the imminent proximity of the Second Coming. The Ethiopian manuscripts suggest that this approach represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of prophetic time and the divine process of global transformation. Instead of a single event happening at a specific moment, the texts describe a series of gradual awakenings that occur as spiritual and social conditions mature to receive higher levels of divine presence. Each generation of dedicated seekers contributes to this maturation through their work of personal purification and social transformation, creating foundations upon which future generations can build even more refined structures of communal life based on divine principles. From this perspective, asking when Christ will return is a poorly formulated question, because the process of return is already underway and will continue to unfold as long as there are people willing to dedicate their lives to facilitating the increasing manifestation of divine love in the world. This process-oriented understanding of the return has profound implications for how Christians interpret the suffering and challenges of the current world. Instead of viewing contemporary problems as signs that the world is rapidly deteriorating toward a catastrophic end, the Ethiopian perspective suggests that current difficulties represent the birth pangs of a new era being born through human history. Wars, social injustices, environmental degradation, and other problems are interpreted as manifestations of resistance from ancient forces that oppose transformation, but also as opportunities for people. The dedicated demonstrate the transformative power of divine love through creative and compassionate responses to these challenges. The texts teach that every genuine act of forgiveness, every effort to forge more equitable economic systems, every environmental restoration project, and every community built on cooperation rather than domination contributes to the ongoing process of the return, establishing a stronger presence of divine principles in human affairs. This perspective provides a foundation for active hope, motivating sustained engagement in social transformation, even when progress feels slow and obstacles seem overwhelming. The manuscripts also preserve unique teachings on the role of women in preparing for and facilitating the return, teachings largely suppressed or distorted in Christian traditions that evolved under the influence of patriarchal cultures. These Ethiopian texts describe an essential complementarity between masculine and feminine energies in the work of global transformation, suggesting that attempts to establish gender hierarchies represent one of the fundamental distortions that must be healed before the kingdom of God can fully manifest. Women are presented not merely as passive recipients of divine grace, but as active collaborators whose unique perspectives and spiritual capacities are essential for the success of this transformative mission. This inclusion of feminine voices and leadership isn't a concession to modern cultural pressures, but a restoration of original balances evident in early Christian communities before they were skewed by adaptations to the patriarchal social structures of surrounding cultures. The text suggests that recovering these gender balances is a necessary prerequisite for Christian communities to function as effective seeds of the coming kingdom. Share your thoughts in the comments on how these Ethiopian perspectives on women's roles in early Christianity could transform contemporary faith communities. We want to hear your reflections on these teachings, preserved for centuries in traditions that maintained closer connections to the African and Middle Eastern roots of Christianity. The spiritual practices recommended by the Ethiopian texts for preparing for the return also differ significantly from the disciplines emphasized in Western traditions. While traditional Western Christianity has often focused on individual prayer, personal Bible study, and participation in congregational services, the Ethiopian manuscripts describe more integrated practices that engage body, mind, emotions, and spirit in coordinated processes of purification and development. These practices include forms of fasting that are not merely abstention from food, but dedicated periods of lifestyle simplification that free up energy and attention to focus on deeper spiritual matters. The texts describe meditation techniques combining sacred prayer repetition with specific body postures and breathing exercises, facilitating elevated states of consciousness where practitioners can receive direct insights into divine will for their lives and communities. Music and dance are integrated as essential elements of communal worship, not merely as entertainment or cultural expression, but as means to synchronize individual energies with cosmic rhythms governing spiritual transformation. These expanded practices reflect a more holistic understanding of human nature, recognizing the interconnections between physical well-being, emotional balance, mental clarity, and spiritual development. The manuscripts teach that attempts to cultivate spiritual life through denial or suppression of the body and emotional aspects of human experience produce an unbalanced spirituality, vulnerable to distortions and incapable of sustaining the deep transformations necessary for effective preparation for the return. Instead, the texts promote a careful integration of all dimensions of human experience into practices that honor the body as a sacred temple, emotions as divine communications, and the mind as an instrument for understanding divine will. This integrated approach produces practitioners capable of maintaining balance and effectiveness, even when facing the intense challenges of social transformation. Having developed internal resources that nourish and sustain their efforts through means beyond mere willpower or purely mental discipline, the economic implications of the Ethiopian teachings on the return represent another aspect where these texts offer radical alternatives to assumptions dominating both mainstream Christianity and secular society. The manuscripts describe a kingdom economy operating on principles of shared abundance rather than competitive scarcity, where value is measured by contribution to collective well-being instead of individual wealth accumulation. This transformed economy wouldn't emerge through external imposition of government regulations, but through a voluntary shift of heart and perspective, leading people to naturally prefer cooperation over competition as a means of organizing productive activities. The text suggests this economic transformation is already beginning to appear in the form of cooperative businesses, nonprofit organizations, and solidarity economy movements that prioritize social purpose over private profit. These initiatives represent seeds of the future economy that will function during the fully established kingdom. Preparing for these economic shifts requires contemporary Christians to fundamentally reevaluate their attitudes toward money, property, and work. The manuscripts teach that excessive attachment to financial security and social status based on material accumulation represents one of the main barriers preventing people from fully participating in the work of social transformation necessary to prepare the way for the return. This doesn't mean poverty is spiritually superior to prosperity, but that true prosperity is measured by one's ability to contribute to the flourishing of the entire community, rather than merely securing advantages for oneself and immediate family. The texts describe communities prepared for the kingdom as places where the basic needs of all members are guaranteed through systems of mutual support, freeing individuals to develop their unique talents in service to purposes benefiting the entire collective. This economic model produces levels of personal satisfaction and creativity exceeding anything possible under competition-based systems, because it allows people to work driven by passion and purpose rather than fear of survival. But how exactly could these radical economic transformations manifest in contemporary societies structured according to competitive and individualistic principles? The Ethiopian texts suggest that changes begin on a small scale through community experiments, demonstrating the viability of alternatives, gradually influencing larger structures, as successful examples inspire others to adopt similar approaches. The geopolitical dimensions of the return described in the Ethiopian manuscripts also challenge traditional Western interpretations that often focus on modern Israel or Europe as geographical centers where prophetic events will unfold. The texts preserve perspectives that place Africa at the center of developments leading to the full establishment of the Messianic kingdom on earth. This African centrality isn't ethnic or geographical chauvinism, but a recognition that the African continent possesses unique spiritual, cultural, and natural resources essential for sustaining a transformed civilization, operating according to divine principles. Africa is described as having preserved connections to ancestral wisdom and communal practices lost in many other parts of the world through modernization processes that prioritize technological development over integral human development. Furthermore, Africa holds biological diversity and natural resources that will be necessary to sustain a global population in an economy based on sustainability rather than exploitation. This Afrocentric perspective on prophetic geography has important implications for how Christians in other parts of the world should understand their role in preparing for the return. Instead of waiting for decisive events to occur in distant locations over which they have little control or influence, Followers are called to recognize that each region and culture has unique contributions to offer to the global transformation process. The task isn't to replicate specific models developed in other cultures, but to discover how universal kingdom principles can express themselves through the distinctive characteristics of each local context. This means European, American, Asian, and other regional Christians are called to explore how their own cultural traditions and natural resources can be consecrated to the service of the transformative mission, working in partnership with African brethren who carry special leadership responsibilities, but without monopolizing authority or excluding contributions from others. This global collaborative approach reflects a more mature understanding of the body of Christ as a diverse organism where each part has essential functions that cannot be performed by any other. The texts also preserve teachings on the role of education in preparing coming generations to live and lead during the period of the established kingdom. The manuscripts describe educational systems that integrate intellectual development with spiritual growth and practical training in skills necessary to sustain cooperative communities. This integrated education produces individuals capable of critical thinking about complex problems, effective communication with people from diverse backgrounds, collaborative work on long-term projects, and maintaining a spiritual perspective that keeps them focused on larger purposes even when facing difficult challenges. The text suggests that current educational systems often fail to prepare students for this type of leadership because they fragment knowledge into isolated disciplines and emphasize individual competition over communal collaboration. The educational transformation necessary to prepare coming generations requires Christian educators to develop curricula that connect academic learning with character development and the exploration of vocations serving the common good. This doesn't mean all schools should become explicitly religious institutions, but that educators who understand the larger purposes of education can find ways to integrate spiritual values with academic excellence in ways that respect students' diverse backgrounds while still challenging them to consider how their talents can contribute to building a more just and sustainable world. The text suggests that students educated according to these integrated principles will naturally gravitate toward careers and lifestyles supporting ongoing social transformation, having developed a deep understanding of how personal fulfillment is connected to contributing to collective well-being. Finally, the Ethiopian manuscripts preserve visions of the cosmic dimensions of the return, placing Earth's transformation within the context of evolutionary processes affecting the entire known universe. The texts describe how changes occurring during the establishment of the kingdom on Earth are part of a larger alignment of cosmic energies that will facilitate similar evolutionary leaps on other planets and star systems inhabited by conscious beings. This cosmic perspective doesn't diminish the importance of earthly transformation, but frames it within a recognition of the interconnections among all aspects of creation and the responsibilities humans carry as conscious participants in evolutionary processes exceeding anything they can fully comprehend. The texts suggest that humans faithfully dedicated to social and spiritual transformation on Earth are simultaneously contributing to the benefit of countless other beings throughout the cosmos, who are affected by the quality of consciousness and love manifested through earthly actions. This cosmic dimension offers an additional source of motivation and hope for people who sometimes feel discouraged by the slow pace of progress or the magnitude of challenges faced when trying to build communities and societies based on divine principles. The texts teach that even small acts of kindness, justice, and environmental stewardship have repercussions extending far beyond their immediate visible effects, creating waves of positive influence that contribute to the elevation of consciousness on scales encompassing not just all humanity, but all conscious life throughout the universe. This cosmic understanding of the meaning of individual actions can sustain long-term dedication to transformative work, even when tangible results are limited or slow to appear. People holding this perspective are able to maintain hope and determination through difficult periods because they understand they are participating in a process of cosmic significance that will eventually result in the complete transformation of all conditions currently limiting the full flourishing of creative potential throughout the universe. The revelations preserved in these ancient Ethiopian manuscripts offer contemporary Christians an opportunity to rediscover dimensions of their faith that have been obscured by centuries of interpretations, reflecting the cultural and political limitations of past eras. rather than the original teachings preserved in sources closer to the foundational experiences of early Christianity. Accepting these teachings doesn't require rejecting everything developed in Western traditions, but rather a careful integration of insights from various Christian traditions into a more complete synthesis that honors both the diversity of perspectives and the fundamental unity of purpose connecting all genuine followers of Christ across cultures and centuries. This expanded synthesis provides a foundation for active hope and transformative engagement that can sustain faith communities through the challenges and opportunities characterizing the coming decades, as the world continues its journey toward the fulfillment of promises preserved in these precious scriptures, which are finally becoming accessible to a broader public after remaining hidden for so long. The invitation stands before every person who hears these revelations, to decide whether they will respond with openness and dedication to the preparatory work that will make it possible for coming generations to experience the realities of the kingdom, promised from the beginning, but only now beginning to manifest through the coordinated efforts of people worldwide who have chosen to dedicate their lives to this supreme purpose of planetary transformation, guided by divine love. Thanks for sticking with us until the end. We'll see you in the next video.